everyone, and welcome to another edition of the ATACS podcast. We are adults who talk about cool stuff, and today we are going to talk about part of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I am your host today. I am Flex from Raleigh, North Carolina. It is March 30th, 2024, and I am joined by a whole bunch of ex-soldiers to talk about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Joining us, we have Nate from Clayton, North Carolina. How are you today, Nate?
I'm doing well. You said we're covering part of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth because, like the Final Fantasy VII remake project, we have to take one piece of media and then split it into multiple related parts to really, dive all the way into it.
Mm-hmm. So make sure you stay tuned for the plot twist ending of part one of part two of Final Fantasy VII remake.
Oh no! Oh no!
That other voice you just heard is Ryan from New York. How are you today, sir?
I'm okay. I'm here, ready to save the planet by fighting whispers, I guess.
And last but not least, joining us, we have Garrison from, I don't know where you are today, sir.
Today, I feel like I'm just at Johnny's Seaside Inn, and I'm feeling pretty good. Like, in Queen's Blood terms, I'm like a 2-pawn right now. Maybe not 3-pawn, but I'm like a good 2-pawn feeling at the moment.
Nice.
Are you there with all the Johnnies?
All of them.
Perfect. And yes, we are, because we need to create more content, #content, as Nate said. We are only covering part of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth today, and go ahead and discuss all the spoiler limits here. This is a big game, y'all. I don't know if you know this. It's
I've
big.
noticed that playing it, that it seems to be a large video game.
Yes. It's a large game, and given the nature of this whole Final Fantasy VII remake project, it's both a large game and a game where almost every little detail can be talked about. So we have decided to split our discussion of it into two parts. I've noticed we've struggled with some of our longer games that we've done podcasts with and fitting it all into one. And for this one, we just said, screw it, we're going to do two. So for spoiler purposes, we are covering the first 8 chapters of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Right when chapter 8 ends, that's where we're cutting off. So anything up through the end of chapter 8 is on the table. We will talk about it. It can be spoiled. Anything after the end of chapter 8 is we are not going to talk about, so you're safe on that front. We are all of us are still playing the game. We are all in either chapter 9 or 10 right now. So none of us have seen through to the ending ourselves, so we don't even really know what happens. Some of us have seen a little bit past chapter 8, but not much. If you're listening to this and forget where chapter 8 ends, I'll go ahead and say that is when you finish all of the stuff in the gold saucer and you get the buggy and are funneled back out to the coral region.
Excuse me, it's the Corel region.
Sorry. Old habits from the 1990s die hard.
From the text-based game where they don't pronounce things and you imagine how it sounds in your head for 20 years, and then they put out voice acting and you're like, wait a second, it's Mako.
Yep. And
I have to ask.
Oh, go ahead. Garrison.
Are y'all Aerith people or Eris people?
I'm Aerith now.
Yeah, I think I've fully switched over to Aerith now, but for a long time I was an Eris person.
Yeah, not a hill I'm planning to die on, but
yeah,
it's very clearly Aerith now. It's been enough games of Aerith that I've converted.
Mm-hmm.
But it was almost a harder conversion to switch from Mako and Tifa and Yuffie and all the ways I pronounced it back in the 90s.
Funny. I don't know that I had Tifa in my head. I don't remember that one being a hard one. Mako, Tamako, hard, yes. Coral to Corel, yeah. I still can't do that one.
Yeah. Also on the table for spoilers is the related greater Final Fantasy VII, the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, if you will.
Yes.
All of these works are related. So any Final Fantasy VII thing that has come out before Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is also on the table for spoilers. Primarily, that's probably, definitely Final Fantasy VII Remake as the first part of this remake project. That one will definitely be talked about. Probably the original Final Fantasy VII as well. Those are the main two if you're sensitive to spoilers for those two. But also, if you're playing Rebirth, you probably know what happens in those.
If you're sensitive to spoilers for those two video games, maybe don't listen to this.
Yes. But other things like Crisis Core or The First Soldier or other things like that could come up. We're not going to actively try and spoil them, but if they come up and are relevant, we're going to talk about them.
Yep.
I think that is all the spoilers out of the way. Hopefully anyone that doesn't want to be spoiled has left. We've described what's going on. So now let's talk about the first 8 chapters of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And how's that Queen's blood, eh?
It's just playing card games and chasing Moogles around. That's what we're doing now, guys.
We've put a stake in it. Like, well, we've now described the gameplay of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Let us move on to the story.
Yeah. So actually, we do want to start off with some more mechanical stuff. And a little bit of table setting is, this is the second part. We had Remake first. Remake covered the Midgar section of the original Final Fantasy. And then a whole bunch of weird twisty story stuff happened at the end of that we'll get to later. But, Midgar, that game takes place in Midgar. It takes place in one city. You do go back and forth between some locations, like you revisit Sector 5 multiple times, but for the most part, that game is fairly straightforward in its structure. You go from one area to another, you have some pretty linear dungeons, and you have some chapters where you do odd jobs around like Sector 5 or Sector 7 or Wall Market. Is that what it's called? But for the most part, you're just going from chapter to chapter, progressing the story, doing some side quests along the way. I think it's safe to say the biggest change from Rebirth, you leave Midgar, and as in the original Final Fantasy VII, you start this globe-trotting adventure where you're ostensibly chasing Sephiroth, but it does have you bouncing around from place to place. And the original Final Fantasy VII was in the classic JRPG mold. You had an overworld that you roamed around, and you'd go into different towns or dungeons. And on the overworld, you could fight random enemies, but it was mostly just kind of a fairly basic construct to get you from place to place. And what they have done in Rebirth is make I have not seen all the areas, but in their promotional material they said there were 7 open zones, but they have made multiple open zones that is each like kind of a mini open world. I hesitate to call this game a true open world because I don't feel like it's that. Like, it doesn't feel like what we normally think of when we say an open world game. Like, it doesn't feel like a Far Cry or an Assassin's Creed or something like that to me.
It does have towers, though.
It does have towers, yes. Or a Breath of the Wild. It's not that level of open world, but within each of these zones, it does feel like a little mini open world.
Right.
And we have multiple of these like mini open worlds. So I think that's as good a first topic as any is let's dig into the open worlds. Let's just talk about the first one. So the first one, you have the flashback sequence, which we'll talk about later in COM, and then you exit COM and you're in the quote unquote the grasslands. So that's where the Chocobo farm is. It's right outside of Calm. It's the area that in the original bridges Calm to the Mithril Mines. A lot of green fields. And then there's a whole bunch of activities you can do. There are some special battles you can do. There are like little live stream pockets, whatever those are called, that you can find. There are some spots related to summons you can find. There are just a handful of activities that you do. Climb the towers, as Ryan mentioned. So I guess first question is, how do you, when you got to the grasslands and started milling about, like what was kind of your first impression of that open zone? Like how did you like the activities, all of that kind of stuff? What was kind of the initial open zone impression?
I guess for myself, kind of have mixed feelings about the open world because and you asked for my first impression, and my first impression was like, wow, this is kind of cool, right? Like, they took what was, as you alluded to from the original game, basically like flat polygons with colors and maybe a few textures representing like deserts or swamps or mountains or whatever, which was cool back in the day, like crossing the swamp or the marshland and having to like not get eaten by Midgar Summer. Stuff like that was kind of evocative back in its time, but they built this game to fill in all that detail by kind of converting it to something like a modern open world game. And riding the chocobos is kind of cool. They've kind of packed a lot of environmental details, things like, there are a bunch of pipes and reactors and like old rundown buildings, and they reference like the war with the Republic and Wutai, and there's all this stuff that kind of is alluded to in sort of a thoughtful way in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. However, I guess there are some caveats with that. I mean, I won't dunk on it and say that it's terrible, because it's not by any means. Although I will say that this engine, you were talking about kind of the structure of Final Fantasy VII Remake, which was, you had sort of these linear sections and sort of these hub areas with side quests. And I feel like Rebirth has those things as well, but the engine, both in Remake and in Rebirth, has a lot of clunk to it, I feel like. I'm not sure if I have an exact description to this, but like, snapping to things, climbing things, like every time you activate a tower and Chadley gives you this 2-minute cutscene where he tells you something, he takes away control from the player so he can explain something. I've started skipping all those cutscenes because it's extremely annoying, but that kind of taking control away from the player, like all the boundaries it puts in place, like invisible things, some cliffs you can jump off, some cliffs you can't. I feel like those things, like the clunk in the engine, plus the fact that I feel like the strength of both of these remake games is in a lot of the cinematics and storytelling, and the world exploration adds very little to that. It kind of feeds in some ways to the combat and some other things, but I don't feel like it always does a super great job of that. So I don't know. It's kind of fun to poke around and do these activities in a way, but at the same time, like it sometimes feels clunky, a bit unrewarding, like, and a bit disconnected from combat and the crafting system is kind of okay. Like, I don't know. I'm rambling a bit at this point, but I feel like it's definitely not perfect. It's not terrible. It's not bad, but like it's kind of just okay. I don't know. The environments are cool to explore. I don't know if you guys agree, disagree, or have any other thoughts.
I would say I overall agree with what you're saying. Like, I think there is something to be said for seeing these environments rendered this way from a close to the ground perspective and having all that level of detail and little story vignettes that play out in that, or just in the lore screens that you unlock as you do things. Like I still am like engaged with that stuff, and for the most part, I would say for the most part, I am enjoying the open world activity checklisty stuff. I was definitely enjoying it more at the start. Talking about first impressions in the grasslands, I was like, yeah, this is fun. I like this. And then the more and more you do those same types of activities, of course, it starts to wear a little bit thin. And then I thought it was an interesting point you were talking about, Ryan, about just like the clunkiness of movement and climbing and boundaries and stuff like that, which is something I had really put a lot of thought to. But you are right that like there's a lot of just kind of general jankiness to that stuff, just done for the sake of making their open worlds playable with the same basic structure and movement that they made for remake. And so there's a little bit of friction there, but it hasn't really bothered me personally. It is very funny to me now that your party gets bigger through the game, like you got like your little crew just following you around everywhere, and you're like jumping up ledges and sliding down ladders, and they're all trying to keep up, and it's like always like feel like I'm like leading a little band of monkeys around. They're just like trying to keep up with me. They'll jump on top of houses when you're standing there talking to somebody because they're like, I don't know, weird little toddlers just following you around.
Yeah, anytime I go through like particularly tight spaces or like climb something that I'm like, how are they going to climb this? I always like stop and turn back and like watch them. And I mean, half the time they just teleport, but they also will just like bound onto the most nonsensical things. It's very goofy.
It's funny, yeah.
Side comment on that: if you try and walk through a tight corridor, especially if you're on Chocobo and you have your whole band with you, and then you try and turn around, you're like, oh, geez, I can't get out now. But anyway,
you get to see Red. You do get to see Red riding a Chocobo.
Red riding a Chocobo is pretty much worth anything. So,
my quick comment on the like, kind of the people your party following you is like there are so many things where it's like, literally, how is Barrett doing this with his like one hand? Like he should not physically be able to do this, and he just kind of does.
I mean, yes. I mean, even just like climbing, sometimes you like climb a rope, and even just Cloud doing it, who has the use of two arms, is like, man, you are climbing so high just using your arms, not even using your legs. Like that is like superhuman strength, and everyone does that all the time.
I can't say I've stopped to watch Red climb a rope. I wonder what that looks like.
Yeah, I haven't either.
I'll have to pay attention to that one.
He probably just teleports.
Oh my.
But yeah, I mean, I think the open world sections are very serviceable at worst and enjoyable to just kind of roam around and check things off at best. They don't ever really hit any high highs for me. But so far it has not ruined my enjoyment of the game by any means.
Yeah, I will say it is nice. Like I have found that between story segments or like a story heavy or combat heavy segment, I do like to kind of just spend some time kicking around either with the mini games or the combat simulator or the open world. Like I think the open world, especially in the later chapters, gets too big and too repetitive. But it is kind of a bit of a pace setter. I also do think that there was just sort of a missed opportunity to maybe have some more banter or character development or world building, which is just this game I feel like is really good at that stuff.
Yeah, I think they get a lot of that in like the named side quests, but not as much in the other open world activities. I do think my favorite thing about, which both of you kind of said, about the open zones is seeing, I mean, in so many ways, like this whole remake project is made for super fans, right? Like it's made for the people who like just really like seeing these characters and these parts of the world like rendered this way, and that is definitely an appeal. Like I like every time I see a location, like I see step out into the Junon region and see the big cannon like rendered up there, like it looks cool and it's neat to see. Like just get the more zoomed in look at like the terrain and everything. Like I think that stuff's super cool. And I think it's pretty clear that they like care a lot about about how all of this is portrayed. And yeah, as for the activities themselves, I'm pretty much on the same page as you guys. Like it's fairly serviceable. I think the quantity and the pacing of it is really where it lives or dies for the most part. Because I think early on, like I think if this like I think I like having it in there. Like if this was another remake that was just like just a bunch of like constant like more linear dungeony type stuff and story segments, I think I burn out on that in a way too. So I think it is nice to have the open zone to kind of break it up. It's when the balance gets off that it's the most frustrating for me, and I've definitely had moments where I was like, oh, okay, this is too much. This is too much wandering around this open zone. But even like talking about the like how this is made for super fans, even the little things of like when you get to like the little life spring spots, I forget what they're officially called, but like where the crystal is that you have to analyze.
Yeah.
And like the music that plays at those, every time that chimes in, I'm like, oh, this music's great.
Like, yeah, there's definitely something to just like this game looks good. It has great music. You get to see all the little pieces of the Final Fantasy VII world, and it has music for everything. Like and multiple arrangements of music for everything, and it's just like that is something, and it's worth noting, and it's worth having these open world segments to have those kinds of interactions with this world for us fans of Final Fantasy VII for sure. And I do think like yes, some of the open worlds do like knock off the pacing between that and the more story driven linear sections of the game. But compared to a lot of like truly open world games, this is still, to me, these open world areas still feel fairly restrained in terms of the number of things to do in each one before you move on to a new space.
Yeah, because it isn't full open world. It is more segmented and more manageable. Garrison, do you want to share any thoughts on the open world? Your impressions?
I won't go too deep because I generally agree with y'all, but just a couple of minor points. To echo like Nathan, I think it's definitely like this is very much a vibes game at times. Like it just like has good vibes, just like the music, the like party banter, like which to Ryan's point, I do wish there was more of just while you're wandering, but even just like during the side quest, the party banter is great. One of the things I really like too, like I'm not really an open world person, but there's like those little emergent bits of open world where it's like, oh, there's the owl for the live stream thing, or like here's the little chocobo to push to a chocobo spot. Like I have so much fun when I like stumble upon one of those, especially when I don't have like a map marker for them yet. Like, oh, look at this cool thing I just kind of like stumbled upon. There's a little hint there to kind of help you get there, which I don't know, like I don't think I would have wanted them to not have the markers with the towers, but I do really like that experience of like, oh, let's just stumble upon this random thing, and like what a neat little surprise that is. So it's like it's fun. Like again, it's not like the best, but each little section is divided up into like discrete tasks. You've got your summon quest, your protolite quest, your fiend quest. I like that division, and I just kind of like the vibes of it all.
Yeah, I guess I was going to mention too, like, one question I would have asked, which you answered, Flex, and I agree with. It sounds like I think you echoed this sentiment, Nate, was whether you would prefer the remake style to the rebirth style. And I think I also agree that overall, especially given the setting and the story and what's happening, but just in general, that I probably would prefer the game with these segments versus without the segments. Although, also, as you mentioned, like, I do wish it was a bit more focused. And maybe this can be a bit of a segue because you have so many of these new mini games, and the open world kind of feels like a series of its own mini games are baked into it. And whenever it gets to be too much between the side quests, the mini games that are part of the side quests, the mini games that are not part of the side quests that are kind of their own things, and then like these open world segments, a lot of which feel like mini games, like the summon button pressing things and the live stream button timing things. Like, there are, I think I am happier with the open world, but there is a lot of it, and there are a lot of mini games, and there are also like kind of mini games in the open world. And I think I would have liked to seen something a little more focused, and maybe some gameplay or story or something that's a little bit of a better fit for the open world. But overall, I do think the game seems like it's probably better with the open world. Yeah, and there are a lot of mini games in Rebirth.
Yeah, yes, there are.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna run down those. I do have one other open world related question: is what do you guys think of Chadley?
I'll be a Chadley defender. I got no beef with Chadley. Chadley's my boy. He tells me where things are, and I go do tasks for him, and then he gives me materia that is sometimes useful, or sometimes just something I slot in so it levels up, and I feel good about that. Chadley's all right.
I think I would like Chadley better if he would stop giving me like a 60 second to 2 minute cutscene every time I do something in the open world, where it actually just takes control away. So, you watch Cloud like reach into the back of his pocket so he can pull out his little communicator. Like, I skip all of those cutscenes because if there's actually something important, it'll just put it on your map.
Look,
I don't mind.
Chadley's just lonely. He just wants to FaceTime with somebody. Like, be his friend. It's okay.
Look, man, the thing is I don't mind Chadley as a character, and I actually don't mind when he's talking, and I can still move around and do things. It's just that, like, literally, like, a third of the time you'll do something on the open world, which is already kind of like a time sink, right? You walk up to the tower, you've done all the climbing, you press the button, and then Cloud does this, like, 1 minute long cutscene where he like scans the tower, and the tower starts scanning, and it's like, I'm watching this, it's like I've seen this 20 times already. And then you finish, and then like 10 seconds later, it's like, why can't I move? And then you hear boop boop boop, and like Cloud reaches, he does this animation where he reaches into his back pocket and like pulls out, and then Chadley like tells you something, and it's like, sometimes it's just a lore dump too. It's like, oh, cool, Chadley, like, you just told me something about the Corel region, which, like, I really just want to get back to playing the game now.
No, you're not wrong. Those things can be pretty intrusive.
Every time now I don't get control back, I'm like, all right, when's he gonna reach? And I hear the little tone, I press the pause button, and I go skip, and like save myself like half a minute of my life.
Yep.
I will take Chadley over May.
Yeah.
But also, you know what? I love a good gimmick. So the little controller speaker, A+. I do love that little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's some weird conditioning going on with that little beep beep beep, like the little whatever the little jingle is that plays whenever Chadley chimes in and wants to FaceTime you. Yeah, the controller speaker is weird. A few days ago, I wanted to play with the volume lower, and I forgot about the controller speaker part. So my TV volume was lower, and then Chadley comes blaring through the controller speaker, like, "Hey man, what's up? What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Oh nope, got to turn that off." Yeah, this game, Chadley is all up in this game. He's like the master of the open world parts. He's kind of guiding all of it, and like. I mean, as far as I know, he's an original character for these remakes, but
He is, yeah.
there are a few characters that this remake trilogy is very obsessed with, and Chadley is probably number one on that list. He is all over the place. If you did not like him in remake, good luck in Rebirth.
He's here. He'll be back for part 3, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm sure, absolutely.
I do think it's very funny with the Fiend battle open world activities, like the special enemy types that you have to fight, and they'll like pop up and start chatting about the enemies, and like half the time I'm like done with the fight and they're still going.
Yeah. That, I mean, Chadley and May talk too much in general, but especially during those intel fights is like they're just nonstop talking, and I'm like, dude, I am fighting these things. They are dead. Like you.
Why are you still telling me about these lizards? I've already killed them.
I said I wanted more banter.
Go ahead,
I just learned tonight you can, like, if you're redoing those fights, there's a setting in the options where you can turn off the dialogue when you're redoing fights. And I'm like, why did I not know about this 50 hours ago?
Perfect.
Nice.
Oh, wow. Yeah, when I said I wanted more banter, I wasn't really talking about the Chad.
Yeah. Oh, he's got plenty of banter for you though.
Yeah, he'll talk all day.
Speaking of those intel fights, yeah, let's talk about the combat, because that is, I mean, a lot of the open world stuff is like, a lot of it does kind of boil down. I would say there's kind of 3 camps. There's like, go to a place and interact with a thing. That's like the life stream thing, or the summon crystals, or gathering ingredients, or like the little, I forget what these are called, but like you get to these spots and it's like, oh, a treasure location. There are like 3 treasure chests here to find.
Yeah.
So it's like, there's a lot of places that a lot of the activities where you just, or activating the towers, it's like you go to a place and you trigger a thing and that's it. Then of course there are the mini games, which we'll get to after the combat. But then of course there's also a lot of fights, and you do a lot of that with Chadley as well, as he has fights. The combat simulator has returned. And of course there are plenty of enemies in the open areas, and for the most part the combat's pretty similar to remake. One thing I appreciate about Rebirth is, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like in remake you barely ever got to choose your party. It was
Correct.
Maybe at like the final battle or something, but like
I'm not 100% sure, but my memory is that you may not ever really get to choose your party in that game.
I think that's correct.
I think it's always set for you based on the chapter you're in.
Even in the final battle, you I think you bounce around between different party
Right.
combinations.
Yeah. So I do appreciate that right out of the gate here in Rebirth, you have 5 characters. You have Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, Barrett, and Red. And you can just customize your party however you want. All 5 of them are with you, and you can fully equip them. You can change them around in your party how you wish. I really appreciate that the ones that aren't in your party still gain experience, and they gain AP for their materia equipped. So I have thus far spent way less time juggling materia around in Rebirth than I ever did in like remake. I was constantly having to go in the menus, reconfigure materia, and that was such a pain in remake. And I'm so happy that every now and then I do in Rebirth, but it's very rare that I have to like go in and do like a big overhaul of materia and equipment.
Yeah.
So I really did you have more there?
Yeah, no, I was just going to echo that if they did not share experience and AP across all characters, I would absolutely like be driving myself insane in this game.
Yeah.
But the way they have it set up is a pretty simple system where you can set up three party compositions that you can very quickly swap between in terms of what characters are active in combat. And yeah, you just kind of make sure everybody has their loadout for what you want them to have, and everybody gets experience, and all your material levels up, and it doesn't matter, and you can switch around, and you can have characters that aren't active in your current group still cast like cure spells between battles and stuff like that. So like it all pretty much works for me, and I like the way they've handled party setup stuff in this game a lot.
Yeah. Especially with all the open world stuff, is it just makes it easy to just constantly change around and experiment. And I feel like, and sometimes I feel like that's one of the intended uses of the open world, is just to experiment with all the characters, because they do all play very differently. Red 13 is newly playable. He was not playable in Remake, but you have him right from the start of this game. And I think it's just good to have time to be able to use each of those 5 characters. Yuffie also joins during this chapter 1 to 8 section that we're talking about. So she also comes into play and plays very differently, but we have actually played as her before because there was the episode intermission DLC.
Right. I guess one thing I would ask if you guys would want this, because I feel like there's no reason not to, is when you're going around the open world, I feel like you should be able to swap Cloud out of your party. Like,
I tried that. I really wanted to do that, and it wouldn't let me, and I was sad.
I have wondered about that. I have tried it early on.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It doesn't seem like the game ever lets you swap Cloud out. There have been some sections where you control other characters other than Cloud, and he's not active in the party. But it seems like if he's there, he has to be in your party. And like that's how the original game handled it too. I'm not mad about it, but I just feel like why not give that little bit of flexibility when you're just running around collecting stuff in the open world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I would like to be able to swap him out for sure. I mean, he's a strong character, so like mechanically, I'm never unhappy to have him there, but it would be nice to just have more flexibility.
Yeah, like I have to force myself to use other characters because he's the one that I default to, because it's, the same thing in Remake. You use him so much in that game, and he's a very strong character. So like I'm very comfortable playing as Cloud. He's very effective. So I have to like make a real effort to try other people, and that would just be easier if I could just say like, let's put Cloud on the bench for a little bit and let some other people come in.
Yeah, I will say to that point, a larger point that's probably worth talking about is like, I'm sure all of us have our favorite characters, and by the time you get Yuffie, you have 6 characters. You can only use 3, so like I've definitely found it very easy to just stick with my favorites. I will switch to others, of course, to like master new weapon skills. And then, of course, there are some story segments where you're forced to use certain characters, but a lot of the time I'm just sticking to my favorites. So like, do you guys find yourself switching around a lot, or do you kind of get in a rut with the same characters, or how have you approached that?
I like switching around to master the weapon abilities, and that has been a good exercise in terms of like making sure that I've tried out all of the characters and got a feel for, using. It forces you to use specific abilities and, to kind of play the characters enough to at least understand or try to understand their core mechanics. But then as I've gone on, I've picked a party that I've settled on. And I do enjoy also just kind of like running with like Cloud, Barrett, Yuffie, with Barrett as usually my lead character. That totally works for me. and I'm happy to plow through a big chunk of the content like that.
Yeah, I switch up every now and then, like especially like it can be a little zone dependent because I feel like some place will be full of aerial enemies, so it's like you want to have Barrett and Yuffie, and some zones do seem set up to favor characters to some extent. Otherwise, I'm like, well, I have a good thing going with Cloud and Barrett and Yuffie, so I'm just gonna keep them around.
Seems like Cloud, Barrett, and Yuffie is the winning combo because that's who I've settled on too.
Yep. Sometimes I swap in Tifa for either Barrett or Yuffie, but yeah, Barrett and Yuffie are also very common mainstays for me.
Yeah, I played a lot as Red 13 at the beginning of the game just because he was the new character and I wanted to get a feel for him. So I played a lot as him, and then for the most part have swapped around a little bit, but yeah, I've mostly settled on that same trio.
Yeah.
I'll go on the record to say I enjoy playing with Aerith, but I feel like MP is like such a precious resource in the game, and she's just not good without her MP, and I feel like I can do so much more with like elemental stuff with other characters without the MP worrying.
Yeah, the inclusion of all the elemental abilities that are just ATB abilities, and Yuffie being so strong with elemental damage with her ninjutsu is like, I never use MP in this game except for healing and buff spells and things like that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Garrison.
So that's kind of what I wanted to mention with the combat is that I really like compared to Remake, they give you so many more options. You get the elemental abilities, you get synergy abilities, you get synergy other things that really, there are too many synergies. So I really appreciate like the amount of options they give you. I think the flip side of that is that I'm an old man. I don't have a head for systems anymore, and there's so many things with the like skill point system and the synergies and this and that. Like if there was like just a couple of those, I feel like they could all like blend really well. But as like this cluster of stuff, I can't keep straight like with whom do I have synergy with? For like, is Barrett the one who I have the electric ability with, or is it like Yuffie you had like it gets very overwhelming and it's hard to keep track of things, but I do appreciate the amount of options.
Or you can do what I did and have everyone learn all of the elemental abilities. and then you just know they all got them all. Yeah, I think between those elemental abilities that don't cost MP, and also we have some new materia. We have fire and ice and lightning and wind. I think those things make it a little easier to just make sure you always have your elements covered, along with Yuffie's ninjutsu as well. Because that was probably the main reason for switching around materia so much in Remake. I mean, there were other reasons to switch around, but like elemental weaknesses are very important in these games because the way the pressure and stagger system works, you want to exploit. And we won't go over all the details in combat because a lot of it is very similar to Remake, and we had a podcast on Remake. But I do think some of those aspects around giving you more tools that Nate and Garrison were talking about do kind of help a lot of that management, help it so that you, no matter who you're bringing into the fight, you probably got what you need to get through the fight. The big new thing in combat is, as Garrison pointed out, all the different synergy things. You got synergy skills and synergy abilities, which to Garrison's point, I don't. It is a lot, and I'm not sure the game does the best job at like kind of drilling home how to use them and like the best flow for that kind of stuff. And even now that I understand the flow, it's still a lot to manage because like if I'm in battle, it's like there are so many skills and abilities between pairs of people that it's like, all right, I'm Cloud and I have Barrett and Yuffie in my team. Okay, which button combos are which synergy skills? So I have to hold block and hit the touchscreen button to pull up what options I have equipped, and I think you can potentially have more than those 4, and you can like equip them. I'm not 100% sure on that if there's more than 2 per character. Like each character has more than 2 with every other character, but there are a lot of skills, and remembering what they all do and how to use them all is definitely a lot. I think there are some interesting wrinkles in it. Like you're mentioning using the elemental abilities. One quirk that don't use MP. One quirk about those is they actually don't give you the synergy ability charge, the little pip. But if you use the ice ability, it won't give you the pip. But then if you use Blizzard, if you use the ice materia that costs MP, it will give you a little pip. So there are sometimes some reason, like if you're trying to charge up synergy abilities, you actually want to use your MP using materia.
See, I've played this game for 50 hours and I didn't even know that. I did not know that using materia gave you synergy.
Yep.
I've picked up on it, but I never use synergy, either because I forget about it, or because the encounter's too short, or because your AI allies aren't very good. They don't generate a lot of ATB to help you build up the synergies. And then like you said, it's a bit kind of complicated enough to sim away.
Mm-hmm. The thing I really do like is the synergy skills, which are the free ones you can do, that are basically like extra basic attacks. Because every character has their basic combos they can do, just to deal damage and build ATB. And the synergy skills are really nice because they're just free alternative basic attacks based on who you have in your party that deal damage generally and generate ATB for both characters, which I think is a really cool idea. It's the synergy abilities and how to generate that meter that feels like a step too far to me.
Yeah.
And I basically don't pay attention to it. It's just if I'm in a boss fight and I happen to see the synergy abilities menu is highlighted, I'm like, oh, I can do one. Great. And I never try for it.
Yeah. And they're really only going to come into play in longer fights because most synergy abilities need, I think maybe some of them only need 2, but the vast majority of them need at least 3 of those little charges per character, which means they're each using 3 abilities that generate charges, meaning not the free elemental stuff. So it's going to take quite a long fight for that to even come into play. I feel like I've kind of wrapped my head around it, and some enemies you need to use synergy abilities to pressure. So that kind of forced me to wrap my head around it when I was running into some of those enemies. And there's also some, I don't know if I should mention this because I don't remember when I got this materia, if it's before our chapter 8 cutoff, but there's also some materia that can help with generating that stuff as well.
I'm curious for y'all. And I feel like the idea with the synergy abilities is to really incentivize swapping between your characters throughout battles a whole lot. Do you all find yourself juggling characters in battles, or do you tend to kind of go with your lead and kind of stick with them for most of the time?
If it's a short battle, I'll just stick with my lead because I'm just going to mash through it quickly. But definitely bosses, and even some of the intel fights where you have or any of the fights where you have specific objectives and are slightly longer fights. Basically any slightly longer fight, I do juggle a lot. I do try and build up ATB with all my characters, and I actually do pay attention to the synergy abilities and try and build up those little pips for them if it's going to be a longer fight.
Yeah, I don't do it for the synergy stuff, but in those longer fights, I do like switching around characters, mainly for 2 reasons, which is to manage enemy aggro and how they're targeting it, because they will tend to target your active character more often than your inactive characters. So like I'll find myself switching to Barret a lot to tank a little bit if people are getting low on health and I just need to like back off and heal a little bit, but also to just like throw off other people's weapon or special abilities, I think they're called. I don't remember what, but like Barrett's overload that he won't use on his own unless you have the specific materia equipped to make him do it. That's just like a
I
powerful
just
ability.
equipped that, by the way.
Yeah. So like that's just a powerful ability that he just won't use unless you have the materia equipped for it. So I'll just like swap over to people to use things like that. Or sometimes I'll be like, well, I really want this one person to be able to use this specific ATB ability, so I'll switch to them to generate more ATB quickly, because again, your active character just generates that a lot faster. So those are the main reasons that I switch around in boss fights. Also, just like if somebody gets paralyzed or sent to sleep or something, I'll switch.
Yeah, I think I can mostly echo what Nate was saying. And I did learn this in the first game as well, because I do feel like the two combat systems are very similar in a lot of ways. Like sometimes it's just better because the enemies do tend to dogpile whoever your active character is. So sometimes, and you can get juggled pretty hard too. But it also, it can be helpful to set up, like either to make sure that your support characters have some ATB in the tank, or like, if you're running like Tifa and Cloud, like to have Tifa like build up her
Right.
unbridled strength and then like do a stagger, build up the stagger percentage, and then like have Cloud unload with limit break or infinity strike or something like that.
Yeah, doing those sorts of things can be really helpful. Your point about juggling is definitely true. Like, this is a game where it can be really frustrating to get like excessive amounts of knockback from enemies. And so I've gotten in the habit of like, oh, Cloud got knocked back, I'm just gonna switch away and do something else. And that alleviates a lot of that feeling of just like, man, this sucks.
Yeah. I think that's true. I feel like the two combat systems between Remake and Rebirth, you all pointed out like a lot of improvements that they've made, and that is true. Like you talking about it reminded me of it. I do feel like the two systems are the same in that, are very similar in some ways, and like the encounter designs aren't always great. I think just because there are so many of them and they're so varied, and some of the mechanics they're trying to be true to the source material, but they just kind of suck. Like to have your character to have enemies that like dodge every attack, like the cactuars or like the burrowing enemies, like or having having encounters where all the enemies fly, and then encounters where all the enemies are like these heavy ground hitters. Like there's just tons of variety. Like the AI is always gunning for your active player. And I think a part of the reason I wanted to mention that is because in talking about like the designs and mechanics of the different characters like Red and Aerith, I feel like, the encounter design, like the combat overall is fun, but a lot of these encounters just don't feel like they're designed to like maximize like the combat experience, because they're just all so different, and like the mechanics kind of hurt some of those characters. Like Aerith like feels like maybe she could be good if MP was less restricted, or you had enough like time to set up a bunch of wards. But what happens when you play her is she doesn't generate ATB that fast, and the enemies all just run at her and like attack her relentlessly. And so she ends up being like this almost unplayably bad character that's really hard to use. And then Red, like, I think his thing is like blocking and building up the vengeance gauge. But like most encounters, you just don't want to be doing that. And your enemies can like throw a bunch of different mechanics and status effects at you that kind of like hose those strategies. So like you're just better off with like these generalists like Cloud and Yuffie and like like Barret, who are just kind of good in most situations. and like build up ATB gauge easily. That's kind of like how I feel things work out. Also, the boss fights, you do sort of have more runway to play with the mechanics, but they usually have these cutscenes that like disrupt whatever you're doing. I hated that in the first game, and it's still kind of annoying in the second game.
Oh yeah, it's the worst. I don't know why. Like that was so frustrating in remake, and I haven't hit any bosses that have been like as tedious as some of the later bosses in remake. I mean, I'm sure they'll come later in this game, but yeah, when you hit those like mid-battle cutscene interrupts and it it interrupts one of your attacks. It's the worst. I still think if something interrupts your attack, it should not consume ATB and MP. That is my gauntlet I'm throwing down is either the attack should pop off or you keep your MP and ATB.
I will say, thinking about like some of the trickier or more like boss fights and stuff that required a little bit more that were maybe made some of those things harder in remake. I remember having a lot harder time with combat in remake than I have so far in this game. Like it seems like a significantly easier game, or they kept the general difficulty level the same and I just understand the systems better and now there are more options, so it just kind of is smoother. But like I mean I remember lots of game overs in remake, even just in like regular fights sometimes. And this game has been pretty easy so far.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. I think this game has been easier. I don't really know why. Like my gut is they just made it easier.
Yeah.
My secondary thought is maybe just having so many more options just gives you so many more tools. Like there were a lot of times in remake where you were just restricted to two characters, and it's like, oh, you have Cloud and Aerith, figure it out with them. Whereas now, if like I run into something tricky, I'm like, nope, I'm bringing in Yuffie and Tifa, and we're gonna just crush it. You know?
Yeah, and materia slots were probably more, like high value in remake, where like
it does. Am I making this up, or do you? If it really feels like I have more materia slots in this game.
It does feel that way, and then not needing all the elemental material to be able to handle challenges because of the elemental abilities and stuff. Like it's like less of a big deal if you don't have the exact right materia. Like there were definitely fights in remake where I was like, oh, I started the fight and used assess and realized that this enemy is weak to fire and I don't have a fire materia on, so I better just restart at the checkpoint and change out my materia so that I can actually win this fight. And that's not so much a thing in this game.
Yeah, which I appreciate.
Yes, definitely.
One more comment, and then if no one else has any other combat comments, we'll move on to our favorite minigames. But Nate, quite a few minutes ago at this point, you were mentioning like having to switch to characters to like use their make sure Barrett uses overcharge, whatever it's called.
One of those, I don't remember. Over something.
Make sure you switch to them and press triangle every once in a while.
Yes, exactly.
I think I don't remember how much of this was in remake, but I do think they've given you a lot of materia options, because you mentioned the materia that will make him use that, and there are more materia than just that as well. I think they've given a lot more materia options to kind of allow the other characters to be a little more automated in some ways. Which I think I still bounce because I'm not like micromanaging my materia to that degree, but I think it is potentially possible in this game to set up your characters such that they are more automated and you don't have to juggle as much, which I think is an interesting way to go.
It is interesting, and I don't mind it. And like honestly, as I've been going through the game and leveling up materia and kind of seeing what all I have, I'm like, at the end of this game, I might just have like everybody have a whole bunch of purple materia that gives them like those like automation skills and like basic like HP, MP stat buffs, and like just let them go. Just let them go.
That is definitely what I'm kind of favoring as well. 'Cause, like I don't have the head for like fancy strategy, but like anyone can use more HP or MP. We'll just shove that on them.
Yep.
Mhm.
And you get a ton of those HP and MP up
Yeah.
materials. So like I'm just leveling a bunch of those, and we'll see what happens.
Mhm. All right, before we move on to mini games, any other combat related stuff we want to talk about? And for all these topics, we'll give updated impressions when we do our second podcast. But anything else you want to share right now?
Do y'all like playing
I will
as Red?
say,
That's my question. Do y'all like playing as Red?
He's okay. Like for me, I consider him fairly neutral. Like
Yeah.
Cloud, Barrett, Tifa, and Yuffie. I like playing all four of them better than Red. But
Yeah. That's my
it
issue.
feels like he's
Go ahead, Ryan.
designed to play like block, dodge, counter stuff,
Mhm.
and I feel like that's just really not what you want to be doing against most enemies.
Well, and Cloud does it better,
Plus,
I
like,
feel like.
yeah, with his vengeance mode, or
Yeah.
not with his Punisher mode is what Cloud's is
Punisher mode.
called.
I feel like Punisher is just better than Vengeance.
Mhm.
Cloud's Punisher is just better than Red's Vengeance. The only like bonus that Red has is he's like can lifesteal with Vengeance mode, but it doesn't seem to move the needle for me when I've tried to play as him.
Yeah, I don't
yeah,
know that
it's
I've
one of those.
seen the Siphon Fang work very well yet.
Mhm.
But anyway, go ahead, Ryan.
It's one of those things like I was talking about with encounter design. Like whenever I'm trying to unlock Red's weapon abilities, like I did kind of have to figure out like how to build up the vengeance meter. But by the time in most encounters, by the time I got it to a decent level or had the enemy staggered or whatever, like they just died. Like
Yeah.
either my NPC allies killed them or like, I took a bunch of damage and then for whatever reason, like just wasn't able to kind of really execute like the Siphon Fang thing.
Yeah, I think that's why I don't like it as much because Clouds is so easy to just pop off and use and is so powerful. His counterattacks. Um, and Reds, you have to build that whole meter and then switch into a different mode, and then yeah, he gets a little bit stronger and can steal life, but it just doesn't seem like the same level of scaling that you see from like Tifa's ability to like buff herself up throughout a fight and do like really cool things that nobody else can do. He doesn't come across the same way to me.
Yeah. His weapon abilities that he learns from each weapon are also like kind of all over the place. Like I don't like when I do play him in a longer fight and he builds up ATB, I find myself not really knowing what to use his ATB on. Whereas like Cloud or Tifa or Barrett, it's like I know exactly what I want to use their ATB on. And Red, I'm like, I don't know, like he's got some weird abilities.
I will say for the first section of the game, the Grasslands region, I played as him as the party leader most of the time, and I would just build to 2 ATB as quick as possible and throw out that Stardust Ray,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
it just nukes everybody.
Yeah. That's still usually what I do with him.
It's very satisfying against like a horde of just like regular mobs.
Mhm.
But yeah, like in terms of boss fights, I don't know what to do with him really.
Yeah.
For the combat, I was going to mention quickly. I don't fully understand the folios. I just kind of try to generally
Yeah.
steer towards like a bunch of passives or synergy skills for the characters which I play. And I kind of like the weapon customization, but I wish that the weapons were more distinct from each other. Like that I had a clear picture of like, oh, this is the critical hit weapon. This is like the unbridled strength weapon. This is the pure physical weapon. Feels like they're kind of going for that, but like it's a little hard to just look at it and figure out like what's kind of optimized or if something is strictly weaker or stronger. Like, oh, this weapon has like 5 materia slots, but like 10 less magic attack than this other weapon that has 2 materia slots.
Yeah, there's a lot of different axes to judge the weapons on. There's the physical and magic attack. there's how many materia slots it has and whether they're connected or not, and then there's the weapon skills, which is a replacement for the, I don't remember what it was called in Remake, but each weapon had its own little folio style sphere grid upgrade path that would really make them very unique as you got deep into those. And I don't mind those being gone for every single weapon, because definitely in Remake I just did like auto choose for me on all the weapons for that system, and I didn't care. But yeah, I don't know that the weapon skills make them feel distinct enough or as clear about like when you should be looking back through those, because you'll just randomly get new ones. It sometimes feels a little confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've had some chatter in our Discord of like, why would anyone use this weapon? Like, some of them definitely seem like not that useful in the grand scheme of things. So they are a little weird, a little all over the place. I tend to not think about it that much. And the game's not been hard enough that I feel like I have to think about it. I use each weapon long enough to learn its specific unlockable ability, and then often switch back to a fairly general jack of all trades one that has enough materia slots for me, has kind of been my approach.
Yep.
And similarly with the folios, I'm glad you brought up the folios, Ryan, but I also don't know that I have much to say about them, because I also just kind of pick whatever, and I'm like, all right, I got the elemental things and I get my synergy stuff, and then I just pick as many general passive buffs as I can with how many points I have after that.
Yep. I almost just want a button to just like automate that for me, because I don't want to deal with it anymore. Just like when I get skill points, just spend them. I don't care. Just pick something.
All right, let's talk about some mini games.
There are too many of them. I think Paul was asking us if Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was actually WarioWare, which I thought was great.
It can't be WarioWare because these mini games take way too long.
Yeah, some of these mini games have like they start with a 2-minute timer, and you can't end it early. You have to go the whole 2 minutes.
Yeah,
and I don't like that.
I would say in broad terms, like, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So, are you going to say something kind of general about the mini games, or about any specific one?
General.
All right, go ahead then.
I would say, I mean, in broad terms, like, a lot of them are very forgiving about retries, and a lot of them are decent, like somewhere in the range of mediocre to good. I just think that the glut of them, like, it was fun for like the first 20 to 30 hours, but now, like, it's still kind of fun, but there are times where, like, I just want to get on with something else, and like, I don't want, like, I was doing a side quest. See where? Oh, okay. That's after our cutoff, so I'm not going to talk about that. But like, even the side quests, sometimes, like, you'll be doing something, and then there'll be like a mini game that just kind of like pops in there, and
Well,
it's
like
at some point I'm like,
the sit-ups game that randomly shows up in the middle of one of the regions. It's like, oh, there's a gym here now. That's what you're talking about.
yeah, stuff like that, where it's like, oh, this side quest now turned into like, a mini game. And I don't know. I understand the balance for game design, like what should be, but there's just so many of them. And that it's not just that there are so many of them, right? It's like we talked about. There's the open world mini games, there are the side quest mini games, and then there are like the dedicated, there's the Queen's Blood, there's like the stuff in Junon, the stuff in the Gold Saucer. Like, there are just entire areas dedicated to mini games, in addition to the fact that they work it into like all these different other parts of the game. At some point, I'm like, and there's crafting, which is kind of its own little system. Like, I don't know. I've enjoyed a lot of them, but I feel like when there are so many of them, and some of them are pretty mediocre, it starts to become abrasive at some points, or like pace killing. But anyway, that's my general spiel.
For sure.
If you would like to
I'm
take it over.
Well, I just wanted to add real quick, like, I'm glad you mentioned like the game design thing, because I would have been so fascinated to be like a fly on the wall in like the meetings where they are planning out all of these mini games. Like, what kinds of conversations must these developers been having about all of this? I genuinely am so curious.
Well, you know, Garrison, there was that one scene in Costa del Sol in the original game where there were some kids kicking a soccer ball, and Red 13 would kind of bat it with his tail, and then Cloud could kick the soccer ball, and it would hit Red 13, and he would go, oh! And then they were thinking, you know, how could we expand this idea into something larger for the player to engage with? And that's why we have Red 13 Rocket League.
You joke, but that's almost certainly how, like, this is my overarching theory about this entire remake project, is like, this is a remake trilogy. It's just about Final Fantasy VII. It's just like any little thing related to Final Fantasy VII is just getting blown up in an overdone way in this remake. Like, all of this is just excess. Like, this is an exercise in the most excess possible. Like, that's what this remake trilogy is. So, in my opinion, the entire reason we have all these mini games is because they're just like, yeah, we just have to go all out on every little aspect, and that's what this entire remake trilogy is about. Every story point is getting blown up, every mini game is getting blown up, every little scene is getting something extra added to it. Like, it is all just about, like, the most Final Fantasy VII possible in every way. Like, that that is the goal of this trilogy. I laughed so hard. You were talking about the soccer ball. Like, I think you had maybe already done the Rocket League-ish game at that point, but you're like, you actually go down on the beach and like a soccer ball or some kind of ball like rolls into red. Not to have another mini game about like batting that back and forth with kids or something. I was halfway expecting it.
Oh man. Yeah. So do you have a full list of the minigames here?
Yeah.
Do we need to do a full ranking, an official ATACS ranking of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth minigames?
So we're not going to take the time. We're already pretty rough on time, so we're not going to take the time to do that today. Maybe we'll do that in part 2, and we have all the mini games.
Okay.
But I am going to run down the list, and I want your quick reactions to these. I'm going to ignore Queen's Blood. We'll have a separate conversation for Queen's Blood, but excluding Queen's Blood, I'm going to talk about all the ones that happened by the end of Chapter 8, and give me your quick monkey brain reaction to these mini games. All right.
Okay.
The piano.
Pretty good. I like it.
Yeah, I'm good with the piano.
I
All right.
am not a fan.
Not a fan.
What do you not like about it,
It's
Garrison?
nice too that it feels out of the way. Like, it doesn't feel like it's got a reward. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
And again, that one comes from something you did in Final Fantasy VII. You could play the piano.
I appreciate it. I'm just not dexterous enough for it.
Yeah, I'm actually not very good at it, and that's one of the things in this game that I've had to retry a lot. But I appreciate the music. I like the piano.
I don't know if we should count this, but the little quick chocobo run around after you get the Bill's farm. And I'll combine with that the stealth games to acquire the chocobos.
Oh god.
I forgot about those.
I forgot about that too. Those were not good.
Yeah.
I love.
I mean, it's a
stealth.
stealth.
I love those.
Yep.
It's a stealth mini game, right? It's there for obligatory variety in a game that already has too much variety.
I guess that's their way of, because you did have to do a little song and dance to get a chocobo in 7. So I guess they, instead of having it in battle where you toss the greens down, now it's a stealth mini game.
Now I'm just thinking about the inevitable future where we are embroiled in a long-term chocobo breeding side quest to get Knights of the Round eventually, and we're gonna have to catch all these different types of chocobos, and I'm not happy about it.
Yeah, you know it's going to be there in the
Well,
third game.
I thought the chocobo catching was going to be a thing, but I think the past 3 areas or something like that, like there have been several areas where you just don't have to, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
oh, you rent a chocobo in, I guess, Costa del Sol, and you don't actually have to catch one.
Maybe they'll rethink that stealth chocobo catching mechanic for part 3. We can hope.
Well, in
You'll
case you were
just have an
worried,
airship.
Ryan. Case you're worried, Ryan, there is going to be at least one more chocobo you have to catch after where you're at.
Oh boy.
I
Maybe
will
shouldn't
say,
have complained.
in defense of those segments, they are terrible. It is very funny to approach an area in the open world where chocobos are standing like sentries in a Metal Gear Solid game.
Yeah.
It is very funny.
Must have been the shadows.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely alerted chocobos and then like just hide for a few seconds and watch their little meter go down, and it's like, oh, the chocobo is no longer alerted. It's like this really is just a stealth.
It's so stupid.
It's real dumb. All right. Moogle Mischief.
Yeah.
Nope.
No. We can't defend this one.
Awful.
It's bad.
And the Moogles are ugly, which is just like an extra
Yeah.
twist of the knife, because I love Moogles.
Yeah, why is that Moogle so weird looking? I don't understand it. Moogles are supposed to be cute.
Yeah, that minigame's terrible. It gets even worse as the game goes on. The first few times it's fairly inoffensive, but it gets real bad.
Yeah.
Getting up to the boat, riding the dolphin.
2 thumbs up.
Totally fine. Like it's like, why is there a mini game here? But sure, why not?
Because in the original, Ryan,
Yeah.
you had to time the dolphin jump just to get high enough, and I don't even remember what you were grabbing, but you had to like grab something or get up to the rafters or whatever it was.
Yep, that's what it was.
Was that actually in the original? I was like, there probably was a dolphin in the original that I just totally forgot.
There absolutely was, and I knew there was going to be something with the dolphin in this game.
As a mini game, whatever, but just the fact that they did do it, like, yes, 2 thumbs up, love it, A+.
Yeah,
that's one of those things where like the cinematic flair kind of just overlaps. It's like almost like a quick time event, right? It's like, here's this little tiny bite of gameplay that's really just all about like the game's like tone and cinematic flair.
Yes. Yeah, this is exactly the type of minigame that I want from this game, where it's embedded into the progression and it's a one and done, like, ridiculous thing that is not a terror to play. Like, that's what I want.
Yeah, I agree. And I think of the ones we've done so far, the Moogle Mischief is the only one that doesn't really have any basis in the original.
Well, it's based on the Mog arcade game and the Gold Saucer, but
right.
From a gameplay perspective, no, there's no basis for it.
Yeah, you're right. There is an inspiration for it though from the Gold Saucer. You're right.
Yes.
I don't know if I'd call this a mini game, but the when you're wandering around the open regions and your chocobo gets a question mark above their head and you have to like find the scent to dig up an item, that reminds me of the hot and cold game from Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah, it is definitely that. And I don't mind that. I don't mind finding things on the chocobo. That's fine with me.
I wish the sniffing animation was faster. I was thinking about that one, and sometimes that's one of those where most of the time I'm fine, but if I'm feeling a little impatient, I'm like, come on, do I really have to do this to like dig up new recipes or whatever? Anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
Fort Condor.
I don't understand it. I beat it on normal mode. I don't understand it.
It was kind of fun, but like 4 rounds, really? Like, in addition to having to travel to different parts of the world map?
Yeah.
Garrison and Ryan, did you play episode Intermission?
No.
I did, but I deliberately did not do Fort Condor in that.
Because
I
this
actually
version,
liked it in the original game.
Yeah, there was Fort Condor in remake. I don't think it worked exactly the same though.
that's what I was going to ask. Because I think the ones in episode intermission, there was something. It was a little different. Like I think you got to choose individual units or something that was different. And I feel like I liked it better in intermission than I did here, and can't really put my finger on it.
So I liked Fort Condor fine in this game. The only thing that made me angry was the last one. I kept losing with like
Because the boss would freeze all your units.
Yeah, he would like freeze all your units, or my I would like summon a hero and they would just like sit there and not do anything, like weird stuff.
Mhm.
And then I would lose with like the boss having the tiniest sliver of health, and that happened to me like 5 times in a row. So other than that frustration, I actually thought it was an okay game. Like I generally enjoyed playing it, but then like it being so like tightly tuned for that final version, and just enough like little hiccups causing me to fail it over and over was frustrating.
The funny thing about that one is that I think I started putting Ballista like just outside of his range. But anyway, I digress. I ran into the same thing that I had to redo it like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
Fun quirk about that game that you can abuse is, for the most part, the difficulty options in the game only affect combat. But for whatever reason, I don't know if this is a bug or intentional, whatever reason, the little meter that charges to allow you to deploy units in Fort Condor is governed by the same limiter of your ATB charge, and that's one of the things that does adjust via difficulty. So if you set it down to easy, that meter actually charges quicker because your ATB charges quicker in battle on easy. So you can actually place units more quickly in Fort Condor if you're on easy.
Nice.
So I did that and cheesed it, and cheesed the hard versions too. And yes, as Ryan pointed out earlier, Fort Condor was a mini game in the original, so this is a very, very clearly just blowing up something that was in the original. The Junon Parade QuickTime event minigame.
That was great. I really liked it.
Yeah, that's another one where I'm like, yep, this is good. You incorporate it into the storyline. It's easy to just kind of go through. I have the same problem that I had from the dance scene and remake, where like sometimes I just don't see the prompts in time.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, like from a cinematic standpoint and like pacing and just like incorporated into the overall game, like that's the way I want them to do it.
I like that it was. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
You go ahead.
I was going to ask, was it optional in the original Final Fantasy VII to do Junon?
No, you had to do it.
Okay.
And the parade scene was particularly really like finicky and hard to pull off.
Yes.
Okay. I remember getting a reward for a good performance or something like that, but I wasn't sure if it was optional.
Yeah, you do, but you have to do it. You don't have to do well, but you have to do it.
Mm-hmm. I agree with both of you that I really like it from a cinematic standpoint. And maybe what I'm about to say is just because I do play a lot of rhythm games, but I think both the Honeybee Inn that Nate mentioned from Remake and this, the actual like rhythm component of it is pretty terrible. Like,
yeah, it's not good.
The icons don't actually line up with the beats well, so you can't do it just listening to the music. You have to watch the visuals. And as you said, Nate, it's also they don't show the visuals clearly enough, and sometimes it's like stuff's coming right through the edge of the screen when you have to hit it. So I think is a very poorly done rhythm minigame. Cinematically very cool, rhythmically very bad.
Yeah. Did you have something, Garrison?
I like that. Like in terms of like the score requirements, it's pretty forgiving. Like you don't have to be absolutely perfect to like get the highest rank, and I did fine. Like it's not like super hard, but also like I did miss some notes, and then that didn't like ruin me. So I did appreciate that.
Yeah, it's also I think worth wrapping into that the like building your squad and like Cloud as the commander of this goofy troop of Shinra soldiers was like a highlight of this game for me so far. So
100%.
that colors me a lot on the whole parade sequence, just because that whole Junon sequence was just really funny to me.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, Junon was great.
Jump Frog.
What?
Jump Frog.
Oh, I had forgotten about this one.
Did you not do this one, Nate?
I don't know. What is it?
It's the Fall Guys game. You're a frog, and you have to avoid the spinny propeller thing.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yes, I do remember this.
Inoffensive? Question mark. It's
I'm sorry,
there.
Ryan?
It exists. It's inoffensive.
I hated this thing so much. This might be my least favorite. We'll see as we get. Man, we have a lot more to go. This one took me so many tries to get the highest tier. I don't know why. I don't know why I was bad at it, but I hated this one so much.
It did take me a lot of tries. It was very difficult for me. I didn't hate it.
I don't know if I bothered.
It was hard.
Yeah, just clearing it was easy, but getting the highest tier was a pain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was the first one where I was like, I'm good at like rank 2. I'm not going to do rank 3.
All right, jumping to Costa del Sol, Pirates Rampage.
Bad.
I like this one. It's a little shooting gallery. I actually quite enjoyed it. I don't think it's great, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I didn't.
Not
hate
terrible.
It,
I mean, the game does force you to do it. I think on your, at least for a side quest. If not, I think you'd have to do it with Barrett, don't you?
I think you have to do all the Costa del Sol minigames once as part of the main quest.
Right.
Yeah, you only have to get like the lowest tier, and then you can go back later in their rewards.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you do have to do it on some level.
I didn't think it was bad. I didn't think it was bad, but I did it was like I had to repeat just enough times to like get that max rank, where it did get really frustrating to you have like a really good first 3 rounds, and round 4 you just like screw up, and it's like, well, back to square one.
Yeah, and I think that was one where there were multiple versions of it that each had multiple ranks to achieve, and that just felt like too much. And by the time I was done with it, I just did not want to do that shooting gallery anymore. So I think that's why I ended up probably more sour on it. I mean, it's like a pretty bare bones shooting gallery game. And then they just require you to do it a lot if you want all the rewards.
Mm-hmm. Is there any basis in the original or anything else for this game?
Not that I could think of.
Yeah, so this is, and I assume not for Jump Frog either. These both seem like completely new ones.
Yeah, I believe that's the case.
All right, Run Wild, aka Red 13 Rocket League.
It's stupid.
Funny?
But it's fine, I guess. It's really
I
dumb.
kind of enjoyed it, but it is kind of like, why am I? I mean, it's really funny. It's like, why am I Red 13 playing Rocket League
against a chocobo and other random animals?
Yeah,
it made me laugh. I can't say I got much enjoyment out of the gameplay side of it.
Yeah, it's not a particularly good or well-tuned game. It's just goofy and silly.
Yeah. I don't know whether to include these, but I'll just mention both of these. In Costa del Sol, there's one game where you have to round up a bunch of the wheelies.
Oh yeah.
You have to round up a bunch of them for one of the companion cards, and then another companion card you have to find. It's called Cactuar Caper. You have to find the little Cactuar paintings or whatever.
I don't really count those. Those are more just like side quests. I mean,
Yeah.
they're main quests, but
All right.
Although
skip
the
past
willies themselves have the driving distance objective thing,
yeah,
kind
which
of
is
like
a
a
side
little.
quest.
All right, the crunch off returns from remake, and based on my memory, it's basically the same as it was in remake.
I don't remember if it's exactly the same, but it's similar.
But harder. It's harder.
Okay, it was pretty hard. It took me a number of tries to complete the highest tier in this time.
Yeah, doing the highest here was hard for sure.
I
don't mind it, but
yeah, I kept failing because I played it enough that I recognized that your opponent gets like 50 or 51 crunches, and I kept getting to about like 46 or 47 and then messing up. That happened to me 3 or 4 times. I was like, oh, it's so close.
Yeah.
Riding the mine cart.
Wait, is that where you shoot things?
Yes.
It's Barrett on rails.
Oh.
Yeah, and you could get score by like hitting boxes and stuff. And then there was also the part of that beforehand where Cloud's party could like set the route that they take, and I wasn't clear on what effect that had, but I didn't mind it. It was fine. That's part of the adventure they were having on Mount Corel.
Good correction. Yeah, I was pretty indifferent on that one. It was to me almost as much of a set piece thing as a mini game, even though it did keep score, but
similar to like the dolphin thing. It's like, hey, you inserted this into a narrative chapter. Good for you. I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Now we come to the gold saucer. The G bike mini game.
No.
Not bad.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not offended by it because it was easy and I just kind of did it and got out. But like, I didn't really want to play any more of that motorcycle game, so it's not good.
Yeah, I agree with that. I did it once and was lucky enough to complete it and didn't want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
3D brawler.
I only did that at the intro, where I guess Dio, which was kind of funny because I think that is a reference to the original game, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a 3D brawler game.
There is a 3D brawler straight up in the original, yeah.
Yeah, and I haven't done it any more than that.
It works. It's pretty similar. I would say that the Rebirth version of it is easier than the original game's version of it.
Yeah,
so it's fine. I didn't mind it.
Yeah, I did do all of it that you can do in Chapter 8. I don't know if more opens up later or not, and yeah, I found it pretty easy. So I just kind of blew through it very quickly.
It did look like from the way the menus laid out that there will be more of it open later.
My gut is in a later chapter that I have not reached, so I don't know for sure. It looks like there's more spaces for everything.
Yeah, I mean, in the original game, you return to the Gold Saucer for some important events. So,
yes,
and I'm expecting that to happen in a later chapter in Rebirth.
All right, Galactic Saviors, which is the space shooting thing.
Oh yeah.
It's like, why does this exist? Like, it just even for like the mini games, it just felt really out of place.
If you feel like sitting down at an arcade in the middle of your Final Fantasy VII Rebirth play, like, there you go. Like, I mean, it's decent for gold saucer points, I guess. Like,
yeah, I think that one and the pirate shooting gallery ones are the ones where, like Garrison said, like, why does this exist? Like, this game would be just fine if these were not in here.
And there's no inspiration from the original for the space one, is there?
No, it's a replacement because it's in the speed square of the Gold Saucer. So it's a replacement of the roller coaster minigame from the original game, which was like an on-rails shooter thing, kind of like the Barrett minecart sequence. So yeah, but there was no space sim game.
On the list I'm looking at, the Musclehead Coliseum is listed, but I don't really think
Yeah.
that's a minigame. That's just combat.
Yeah.
It's basically like Chad Lee's combat challenges.
Yeah.
Chocobo Racing, just the proper Chocobo Racing in the Gold Saucer. I actually think is pretty good. It's like it's not as good as Mario Kart, but it's like it kind of has a Mario Kart like feel. Like you have drifting, you have boosts, you have items, or the little balloons or whatever they are that you run into that can increase your speed, kind of like coins do in Mario Kart. Like
This
I don't
is
think
the
it's,
one.
I don't think. Go ahead, Garrison.
So this is the one besides Queen's Blood where I'm like, oh, like I would actually just play this. Like this is a fun game.
Yeah. I like the Chocobo Racing. It is a lot like Mario Kart and simplified in a lot of ways, and doesn't have randomized items, so that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not bad.
And then the last one in Chapter 8 is Desert Rush, which is breaking the boxes, which was also in Remake.
Yeah.
I just brought that back. That is a lot of minigames.
Yep. I wasn't a big fan of the box breaking minigame in Remake, and
Me
I'm
either.
not a big fan of it here either.
Same. So let's talk quickly about Queen's Blood. And then we do want to touch on some story stuff. Or should we just save Queen's Blood for our next podcast?
We can give our quick thoughts on Queen's Blood at least.
All right. Yeah. So how do you guys like Queen's Blood?
I mean, I've been doing as much of it as I run across. It's one of those where I do enjoy it enough to do it. Like, I don't think it's particularly, like, I'm not sure what the right word is. Like, it's not super complicated or anything. It's not like playing a game of Magic the Gathering or something like that. But it's kind of fun to like, oh, I'm in a new town. Let me hunt down 3 Queensborough Blood players and tune my deck a little bit and like throw down in these matches. I don't know if there have been like any rewards. Like it's not like a triple triad or whatever, right? Where you cash out your cards for items. At least not so far as I can tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Not that I've
Outside
seen
of like
either.
some of the specialized things like the gold saucer challenges or whatever. But it's kind of fun.
I think to Ryan's point, one of the things that I like is that like just hearing like some of the early like reviews and stuff, people talk about how great it was. I thought like there was gonna be so much Queen's Blood, but really like they dole it out in very small amounts. It's like, oh, here's like 3 matches to have at a time, and so like you do it, you have fun, but also like it just stops for a while, so it doesn't get to be too much.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. Like they could have put so much more Queen's Blood into this game than they actually did. And I think that's probably the right call. The amount that we got. I think
I
it
mean,
is a pretty. Go ahead.
I was gonna say challenging Red on the cruise ship. That was pretty sweet.
Yeah.
But that's almost more of a story thing. But
yeah, no, that's true though. They do weave it into the story in a couple places. I think it's a pretty good card game overall. I think like the basic structure that you generally are engaging it with, where you can like challenge an opponent and mulligan as many cards as you want and retry freely and all that stuff, like just makes it very smooth and easy to engage with. Like if they were going to break this out into its own thing, like as a real collectible card game, they would need probably to do more with it. Like I actually just and maybe this is after the end of chapter 8, I don't remember, but I think it's in chapter 8 in the gold saucer stuff. There's one where you do like 3 rounds drawing from your same deck, and you get like 5 cards each round. And I was like, wow, okay, this is how like an actual Queen's Blood game would work if it was going to be like a serious card game. But for something that is just kind of inserted into this larger structure, I'm perfectly happy to have it just be like this fairly smooth, like bite-sized thing that it is.
Yeah. I kind of. I might save more thoughts on for our next time once I see how it evolves more, but I feel like it's existed in, like I like Queen's Blood and I like the mechanics, and I feel like it's existing in some weird space where it's like both starting to get a little too complicated in how many cards I have and how many deck building options there are, but also still simple in the strategies and how easy the matches have been. So it's like, it feels like it's not realizing its full potential, but also I don't know how complicated I want it to be. So I'm kind of in this weird headspace with it where I liked it a lot earlier on, and like now that it's like ballooning out more, by the time you in chapter 8, I'm not quite sure how I'm gonna end up on Queen's Blood, because I really like Triple Triad, and I think part of the reason I liked it is because it was so simple.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was even simpler than Queen's Blood, and the rewards you get from it were very obvious. You get items for the cards you have, and like a powerful card was just powerful on its own. You didn't have to it didn't have to synergize with your other cards. You just put good cards in your deck and you're good.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not quite sure where that's going to land for me on Queen's Blood, but I do enjoy the mechanics of it, and I tend to get excited when I see new people to play. I almost wish there were more people to play. I almost wish I could do the Final Fantasy VIII thing of just walk up to anyone and be like, "Hey, you want to play Queen's Blood?"
Yeah. I get what you're saying though about, like, it feels like there's untapped potential there because there are so many seemingly synergies and deck types you could go to, but it's with the way it is structured in the game, for the most part, it's easiest to just hit retry and hope for a better draw than to like say, "Oh, I'm gonna go make a new deck," because
Yes,
you're gonna be able to luck into a win in most cases if you just retry a couple times.
that's exactly how I approach losses. Is like, yeah, if I can tell the match is going bad, I hit retry and like,
Right.
like, yeah. All right, so I think we should a little bit of our podcast. We'll touch on some story stuff, and obviously we're gonna be very story heavy on the next part of the podcast we do. But I think there's still some good stuff to touch on here, especially the early stuff, because knowing me, I will probably forget some of the early stuff before before we get around to doing the next podcast. So yeah, just kind of kicking off from the beginning of this game. It opens in a very like and again for listeners, we're not going to talk about anything past chapter 8, but the very beginning of this game, it opens with you controlling Zack. Like you see scenes of like news footage almost of like, oh, this tornado has come through, and you see like Tifa and Barrett and like, your party like being put in helicopters on stretchers, and like very clearly something odd's going on, and you actually play as Zack, and you go find, you get Aerith from one of the helicopters, and you take her to safety. All of this is just like completely left field from, the actual final, like none of that happened in the original Final Fantasy VII. Zack was dead, So like, what is my basic read is yes, this is an alternate timeline. What is your all's takeaway? And I honestly haven't spent much time thinking about it past that. I'm like, oh, this is an alternate timeline. I'll figure out what happens later. Do you guys have any more complicated read into it than that? Do you have any other theories of what's going on with that scene? And I guess we can also just wrap all the Zack stuff that happens in the first 8 chapters here. Like, what's going on with Zack here?
I mean, they definitely want it to be a question of what's going on with Zack. And so far in this first 8 chapters of Rebirth, they haven't done anything other than ask the question.
Mm-hmm.
So a part of me is kind of like, was excited that they were leading with that, and then also like maybe a little bit like, okay, can we get a little bit more? But I'll have to obviously save save some of my reservations on that until I've seen the full game. But yeah, clearly some kind of alternate timeline shenanigans going on. How that's going to impact the main storyline, I couldn't guess, other than it saying that it will in some way. But yeah, that's where I've landed on it for sure.
My my galaxy brain theory is that it's actually just like it's something in the live stream. I don't actually believe this, but I'm like, maybe it's like Zach's dead. He's in the live stream, and like, you know, later points in the remake trilogy, other people might end up in the live stream. And like, again, I don't actually believe this, but I started like Galaxy Brain, like, doing that like FBI like drawing lines kind of thing, and
I think that's a possibility. I don't think you should discount that idea.
I would be more inclined to believe it if we didn't have an alternate version of Stamp, which clearly suggests timeline. Otherwise, I would be like full on Galaxy Brain theory on this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think alternate timeline is the most sensible, and that when the events at the end of remake happen and you defeat the Whispers, that there was a timeline split, and
especially with the ending of remake, and it seemed like Sephiroth just opened a portal to another dimension, and there was a tornado there, and it was tearing apart the city, and then that kind of imagery all comes back.
Yeah, so I have two questions about the Zack stuff, and again, these don't really have answers, but when they said a tornado, my first thought was, is it a tornado made of whispers? Like,
it could have been
causing destruction because of all the stuff that happened at the end of remake?
Yeah, it definitely could be.
I mean, that's kind of what you were in the middle of, right? There was like Sephiroth and a bunch of whispers flying around, and I mean, didn't you eventually end up fighting on like up in the air?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so kind of my read of that opening scene with the tornado is like that happens right after the ending of remake. Like they're still on the highway, and the tornado of whispers like hurt the main party, and in this timeline that was created, Zack was. But then, are there two clouds? Because Zack brings in a cloud, like he's dragging in the cloud from the end of Crisis Core into the city, and was there also a cloud with the party that killed the Whispers?
Yeah, I mean there must be two of all these characters in these two timelines, because we see them depicted that way. So I do think the straightforward read is when they fought Sephiroth on the highway at the end of remake, there was he created some sort of dimensional rift that they walked through and fought the Whispers. And that's the alternate timeline that we're seeing Zack in, because Midgar was like destroyed in that whole sequence, and then they came back to their timeline and continued on their adventure.
I guess like for me, I'm just kind of rolling with the story, and like every now and then it'll be interesting to see the clues that they drop. Like one thing I can think of is in, I think, Costa del Sol, Aerith has her white materia and it's clear. And you know, I don't really try and read into that too much, but it does feel like there's some sort of connection between like, you know, events that were supposed to happen, or events like for some reason, I guess, I don't know if that was always clear or if it was only clear in the original game after she died and, you know, kind of set events in motion. Like, so I don't have enough context and I don't really worry about it too much. Like some of the whisper stuff in the original game was my least favorite part of the storytelling. But in this case, you know, they keep it brief enough. Like you have the cameras like at the very beginning of the game, you see the alternate version of the characters, and then it just kind of moves on with the story. So it's like, oh, okay, I guess they're setting something up let's go with the main plot and see what happens.
Right.
The other quick question is, after one of the early Zack scenes, it like cut back to Aerith, and it was almost like she could sense what was going on. So that was my read. Does anyone else have a different read there, or do you think Aerith does have some kind of connection to whatever's happening with Zack, and like she can kind of sense it? Like
Yeah.
when I say Aerith, I mean the Aerith in our timeline.
Right. Go ahead, Garrison.
My other galaxy brain take, and this is why I actually like feel like more confident in, is that I do think like my hunch right now is that the game is going to end with Zack's Aerith waking up and probably knowing everything that happened with our Aerith. That's my like, I'm planting that flag down. That is my bet for the end of the game.
Yeah, and I could see something like that for sure. I mean, they planted this speed with Aerith in remake, and they've continued it. She is something going on that she is not divulging to the rest of the group. She knows a lot more than everyone else.
But she forgot some of it, right? That's where I kind of have lost
Yeah.
the plot a little bit. Like, it's like the whispers made her forget things. Like, she's referenced that, but I don't remember that happening in remake, and so I'm kind of confused at what she does and doesn't remember.
Mm-hmm.
I also kind of, I mean, I guess depending on what exactly we're talking about her forgetting, but if she is, we speculated in our remake podcast that like this is an Aerith from the original Final Fantasy VII, but maybe in some of her timeline hopping, like maybe she has seen different stuff, and maybe there's some stuff she hasn't seen. So like, I don't know, maybe this is a different Aerith in some ways, and like some of the things she doesn't know is because she was never that Aerith that was there. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It is all very strange.
One thing that is also, I guess, relevant to both remake and rebirth is that Sephiroth has kind of been the villain from the beginning, right? He was presented, and he's closely associated, for whatever reason, he's closely associated with the Whispers. And, you know, their motivation for doing a lot of the things that they're doing is to find Sephiroth. Whereas I think in the original game, a lot of times they had smaller goals, you know, until Sephiroth kind of became like the foremost threat. Whereas in this game, Cloud has pretty much been chasing Sephiroth, I think, throughout. And, you know, there's still questions about like, you know, Cloud kind of losing control of his mind. And like, you know, I think as you're crossing the swamp, like, and you have the Midgar Summer fight, which in the original game, I think you didn't fight him. But then when you come back through, Sephiroth had killed him. But in this game, like as you're going through, like something happens for some reason, and like Midgar Summer ends up dying the same way he did in the first game. Like there's a lot of these weird kind of events floating around that are kind of close to the original game, but they play out almost arbitrarily. You know, in some ways, almost arbitrarily, like going the same direction or a different direction as the original plot line.
Yeah, that was actually a scene I wanted to bring up. Is you fight the big snake, and it is an optional fight, and if you actually do fight it, it normally just kills you because it's stupidly strong in the original. But you don't have to fight it, and you just see it impaled. But then you do fight it here, and they made it look like Sephiroth saves Cloud, because Cloud's like drowning at the end of the fight with the snake. And I don't know why Sephiroth was there and did that. I don't really have a read on that.
I don't know. I've maintained the position that I believe Sephiroth will become a non-villain by the end of this whole series. He will become a hero of some sort, and not be the villain of part 3.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe this Cloud is Sephiroth.
Maybe, who knows?
I do
I doubt it,
appreciate.
but
One thing I do really like about Rebirth is they're leaning. Based on my memory of the original, is they're in Rebirth they're leaning a lot more into the fact that Cloud is driven towards the reunion and he's not in control of himself. They have a lot more like little scenes of like him doing something or starts walking or whatever, like out of his control. That he's being controlled by the Genova cells and all that. And like, I think they're doing a pretty good job of portraying that, which I think is really interesting.
And I think they're doing a lot more to sow doubt in characters and motivations, and like playing up Genova as this sort of mastermind, puppet master pulling the strings. So I definitely think we're headed towards a reveal of some sort about Genova and what their plan is and how it relates to all of what's going on. Whether that ends up being, one of our main characters is actually Genova in disguise, which I've thought about as a possibility, or something like that. I don't know, but I think that's on the table.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have so many questions. So in the original, so in my memory of the original, during this portion of the game, you were just chasing Sephiroth or like following him.
Yeah.
Like that was basically from when leaving Midgar to the end of Disc 1 is you're just chasing Sephiroth. But it's not the real Sephiroth.
Correct.
It's a like pieces of Genova. Like Genova's like appearing as Sephiroth.
Right.
Do you think the Sephiroth? I mean, I guess we've only seen Sephiroth in like weird little flash scenes. Like, is that just in Cloud's psyche? Is it the real Sephiroth? Like,
I think Cloud sees Sephiroth whenever he comes into contact with other Genova cells.
Mm-hmm.
Like you see the robed men, and he'll imagine that they're Sephiroth for a minute and be like about to kill them, and then somebody jumps in the way and stops him.
Right.
So like, I don't think we've seen the real Sephiroth yet. Just like in the original game, you don't technically see the real Sephiroth until his body appears at the northern crater.
Right. And by extension, we would say the Sephiroth we see in Remake Part 1 is also not the real Sephiroth. Yeah.
Right. That's my assumption, but I don't, we can't know that.
So here's a theory. What if when you're fighting the Midgar snake, I never know how to pronounce it, the giant snake, that like Cloud is actually the one that like slices the snake and shoots it out of the water, and it lands on the big spike, and it's not Sephiroth at all. It's just like Cloud thinks he sees Sephiroth because maybe there are Genova cells around or whatever, or it's
Genova cells in him. So
so he just sees he thinks he sees Sephiroth, but it's not actually. Cloud actually does all that because none of the other characters have a visual on Cloud at that moment.
Yeah, I'd have to rewatch that scene, but that seems plausible to me.
Okay, if nobody else has anything on that, I actually want to talk about the flashback in Tifa. But before I pivot, is there anything else with this topic before I pivot?
No.
All right. So yeah, I mean the big thing we all knew was going to be basically at the start of Rebirth is the Nibelheim flashback, because that's the first thing you get when you leave Midgar in the original. And for the most part, I think this pretty much followed how the original went from my memory. I did think it was really well done. I thought it was really cool to see a lot of that.
I love the one thing that I love so much about the flashback sequence is how Cloud's mannerisms were just Zack.
Yes.
Yes.
My favorite stuff in Rebirth has been exactly that. Has been like making all the like, because when you first play through the original, you don't know that Cloud's inheriting Zack's memories and persona and all of that stuff.
And with the polygons and like the lack of detail and stuff in the original, they can't convey as much, and like no voice acting and that kind of thing. But like it's so clear playing that sequence after playing remake that like it's acting a little different here. Like even if you didn't know who Zack was, I feel like you could pick up on that.
Yeah. I think they've done so great with that. Kind of similar to what I was saying about how they're portraying Cloud as like not in control around the reunion stuff. Like I think just a lot of those things that were not clear and always clear in the original, they're just doing a really good job portraying all that. Sorry, I think someone else was about to talk.
Oh yeah, a few things about that. Yeah, one thing, like you said, is throughout the game, like stuff that was optional kind of gets folded into the story. It seems like the devs are kind of aware that the player probably knows what's going on, and like you said, kind of Cloud's mannerisms plus like I think Tifa looks really uncomfortable throughout the story, and it's pretty strongly hinted that she remembers it differently. But also just this section. One thing that I didn't like about remake, and didn't like as strong, but I felt like in remake they really just put Sephiroth as the villain, like almost from the first few hours, right? Cloud just sees a vision of Sephiroth and like goes after it and attacks it, like. But in this section in Rebirth, like it shows it does a great job of reliving that sequence where Sephiroth is a war hero, right? He's like kind of a nice guy, and then he just totally loses his marbles. And they kind of execute that very well. Also, I think if Cloud goes to his house, like, and talks to his mother, like his memory just gets all scrambled there. I think that happened in the original game as well. They had these like fast cuts.
Yeah.
Because
and I thought the way that they the way they handled that in remake was kind of interesting, or in Rebirth rather. But yeah, I did really like the way that they kind of replayed that. Sephiroth starting out as the war hero, he's kind of like a nice guy, and then he just like becomes like a little scarier and a little scarier, and then Cloud finds him like in the basement reading all those old books. Yeah, I thought that whole sequence was pretty great. And one thing too, just in general, we've alluded to this in talking about the gameplay and stuff, but one thing that was good about remake that Rebirth also is just great at is like just the cinematics, like the character, just like the character chemistry and energy and like all of that stuff and the little details they put into it. And like the way the characters present themselves, and a lot of times, they're lighthearted and funny, and the storytelling of both games, I think is just really well done.
That scene, the infamous scene where Sephiroth does all the murdering, was, I think, pretty impactful here. I think they handled that really well. And then, of course, you have, right after that, they go back up to the reactor, and you have the little confrontation with Tifa and Sephiroth, and then Cloud and Sephiroth, Cloud/Zack. But one of the things they're really drilling at in this game is, during that little confrontation, Sephiroth slices Tifa. In the original game, they never really discussed it. It's just like, all right, yeah, she got cut by Sephiroth. It was a bad injury, but she healed up from it over time. And it was never really a discussion point in the original that I remember, but they are really hammering this point in Rebirth, and I don't know where this leads. They're hammering it so much, I feel like they have to do something with it. And like there is a path where they go with this, and it's just Sephiroth/Jenova just like trying to manipulate Cloud, and there's actually nothing wrong with Tifa, and it's just pure manipulation on their part. That would be like the really straightforward outcome of this is that it's just there to make Cloud doubt and go crazy. But yeah, they're seeding these seeds of that Tifa actually died in that attack, and then who is this? This is not the real Tifa. Is it a Genova something? Is it some kind of clone, or what is it? And I guess and they keep plugging, like, there's been no resolution of that in the first 8 chapters. They keep hammering that point. So, like, do you guys think there's anything to that? Do you have any insightful reads or predictions on that? Or is that another one of these points where they've posed questions, kind of like with Zach, and we're just not getting answers yet, and there's not really much to read into it yet?
I mean, we could definitely have theories,
weird.
but it is one of those open questions for sure. Go ahead, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
I think Cloud usually is doubting Tifa when he's kind of not in his right mind. It would be a little weird for them to be like, oh, he was right all along, and Sephiroth was warning Cloud about Tifa, and it turns out Sephiroth is actually a nice guy. Like, I don't know. It is a little weird that usually the persona that's accusing Tifa is like Cloud's visions of Sephiroth, if I'm not mistaken. So, like, it is a weird angle for for Tifa to be like something suspect.
I think it's probably misdirection. Go ahead, Gary.
So I think it's probably like misdirection, especially for like new players. For people who are familiar with the original, it kind of expands upon kind of the memories, and like that was one of the plot points in the original that never quite gelled, is that like Tifa didn't really say anything, and this like gives more reason for like Cloud and Tifa to not have the conversation, or like for Cloud not to believe anything. But I think also like for people who haven't played the original, it kind of sows some doubt in their mind, and that might mean other twists and later in the game might land stronger for them if they wouldn't see that one coming.
My big, mostly unfounded prediction, and I'd have to go back and look at some of the things that Sephiroth or / Genova says to Cloud to sow doubt about Tifa, is that he's maybe talking about Aerith instead of Tifa. Because he says things like, I killed her. Like, I don't remember exactly what he says, but like, I think there's a possibility that he's trying to reawaken some memory in Cloud about the original events of Final Fantasy VII. I don't know exactly that I've thought all that through yet, but I had that thought when I was thinking through this the other day.
That's like, like multiple layers of misdirection.
Yes.
And also, how many women has Sephiroth stabbed that he could say is dead? I do think Cloud and Tifa's relationship is, I mean, it was interesting in the original, but I think they're exploring it even more here, because like, they were childhood friends, and a lot of that stuff 5+ years ago they both experienced, and like the original Final Fantasy VII was just such a great example of like a unreliable narrator. Through most of the game, you think Cloud's version of events are the truth, and it turns out they're not. And Tifa knows they're not. She may not know everything, but she knows Cloud's not telling the correct story. And they do a really good job of like, when Cloud's telling the flashback scene, like every time the camera pans to Tifa, it's like, it's clear that she's like, this doesn't seem right, but she also doesn't speak up. And like, in my read, I think it's pretty clear that Tifa recognizes something is really wrong with Cloud, and has recognized it since the beginning of Remake, since Cloud showed up in Midgar with Avalanche. And she's like, doesn't know how to address it, but like really cares for Cloud as a childhood friend, and he's just like broken and has all this trauma and was like, not fully put together. So I do like that they're poking at that relationship more and trying to explore that, and like, whenever they, in theory, do have the scene that happens late in the original where Tifa helps Cloud piece everything back together, like, I think it could build, we're not there yet, but it feels like they're building more context around like that relationship and how that will pan out.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is true, yeah. And every time she tries to poke at something that, he should have remembered or should not have remembered, like he gets like the headaches or whatever. So it's just always hard to like breach those subject. On the note of, I agree with you about Tifa and Cloud's relationship being more interesting, but it's also like there's Cloud and Aerith, and like especially if you do the side quests, it seems like they're just always going on together.
Yeah. She's always forcing him to go on dates against his will. Like,
I think even in Calm, like you go to the tower and that's like kind of a required quest, maybe. Like, and then Tifa's like, "Hey, where were you guys?" And Aerith's like, "We were on a date."
mm-hmm.
And Tifa's like, "Really?"
Yep.
Yeah. This game,
it's funny too, because like I don't remember the scene exactly in Remake, but like there is that point in Remake where like if you have that like conversation with Aerith, she's like, "Don't fall in love with me, Cloud," and then now she's like super into him, which again I feel like there's things with her memories that I still haven't quite put together, but I'm kind of curious to see how it all resolves, and curious to see who I take on a date at the Gold Saucer.
Mm-hmm.
This game's very, very horny in that way. Is very like people talking about dates all the time. There's even that little quip on the boat from Junon where like Aerith and Tifa sit down and they're like, "Oh, it's time to talk about business." Or
boys.
Yeah. And then the other one's like, "What?" And then she's like, "Boys." And then they get cut off and don't actually have that conversation. But
yeah.
Like this game's very about dating and those relationships, which the original was in a degree, but not like this.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do think that is kind of part of Aerith's personality, is like poking at Cloud in that way. Like I could be off on this reading. I don't think she actually thinks of it as a real date, teasing Cloud. But I don't know. There was a really interesting line or handful of lines from Aerith to Cloud on the beach at Costa del Sol when you like finished after Hojo, all this stuff with Hojo and whatever, where she said something like, "I hope you're ready for the moment when it arrives," or whatever, and Cloud's like, "Oh, I'll be ready," and then she's like, "Not you, silly, I'm talking to future me." And then she's like, "You'll love her when you meet her." And like, I don't know if that's just the headspace I'm in with this game, but I definitely read that as like Aerith is legit talking about like a different timeline Aerith who is going to come in at the moment where Aerith dies and things are going to happen.
Yep.
I totally read that way. I don't know if I was meant to read it that way.
I think that's intentional from the writers to make you think that, yeah. Whether that ends up being the case or not, I don't know, but I think that is 100% intentional on their part.
So kind of zooming out a little bit, we're not going to go much longer here. I think most of what happens from chapters 1 through 8, other than the stuff we've already talked about, mostly follows the beats of the original. Like you get all your main set pieces, all your main story beats, like all that stuff is still pretty much tracking. I do want to save Barrett's arc for next time because I want to give that a little room to breathe. That does happen in chapters 7 and 8, but we've already gone long, so I do want to save that arc for next time. Is there anything else before, the Corel stuff that we want to touch on story-wise before we wrap up this part of the podcast?
I can think of a couple things fairly quickly that we had touched on. Like we touched on how Junon was just kind of fun. Um, they've got the big iconic cannon, but I do think the participating in the military parade, the whole setting there, it felt like they turned it up just enough to where it's maybe a little cartoonish and fun, but not like slapstick or silly or stupid. Just like they broadcast the parade on TV, like just all the setting. They had the big presentation by Rufus. All of that I thought was, it had that kind of military parade atmosphere. It was just super well done. And I will say that I think characters, this was true of remake as well, but I think a lot of the added content I think works pretty well. And characters like Elena, in the original you had Rude and Reno, and they took maybe some inspiration from Advent Children and built those characters out. And in this game, Elena and Yuffie, I think in particular, just have so much more personality. Characters that didn't have personalities or weren't in the original game, sometimes they get content and that's cool. But like, also you see like Yuffie feels like a very real character so far in Rebirth, whereas she was kind of this optional character who like didn't do or say a lot, I feel like, in the original game. And now she's just kind of like part of the team, and is actually like a pretty big personality in the group. And similarly, like Elena shows up with Rude, and she's always like yelling about something, complaining about something. Like she's like the young Turk. Sung is like kind of like the cool, collected one, and Rude is like kind of like the very smooth one, and then Elena is like the young one who complains a lot. So I think they've done some pretty great stuff with some of the kind of new content around these characters.
Yeah, that's definitely my biggest takeaway like from this game is that like just the character writing is just so charming in this game. I don't even know if I look like, capital G good writing, but just like I love the character interaction. I love their banter. And that just makes this game like so much more fun. And it makes me want like more games to have like this kind of party system where you are chatting with your friends as you go through like the open world stuff and through all the stuff. So I love that so much.
Yeah, for sure. Another character
Yeah.
that's gotten more spotlight that I think is interesting, and I'm curious to see where it goes, is Rufus, the new president of Shinra. He's gotten a lot more dialogue and scenes that are complete like non sequiturs. Like you'll just get a random snapshot of what's going on with Mr. Rufus, and I think that's an interesting choice. And then I thought the scene with them in Junon where he kind of calls out your party and finds you, and then like offers a deal, and Yuffie of course messes it all up, but like he was willing to not be the villain. He was at least seemed genuine to be like, hey, we have a common enemy, we can work together. Like you stay out of my way, I'll stay out of yours, and we can find Sephiroth. And like I thought that was an interesting way to kind of change up his character instead of just him being always in the background and Shinra always being the enemy.
Yeah, I agree with all of that for sure. Yeah, because Rufus surprisingly didn't have as big of a role as he could have in the original. So it is interesting to see that fleshed out here. And same with Yuffie. Like, I mean, Yuffie was an optional character in the original, but I appreciate that she's baked more fully into the story here. I also appreciate, as someone who played 7 a lot, the original game a lot, I should say, when they have lines that are almost verbatim from the original, like when Elena pops up and she's like, the Turk's latest and greatest or whatever, is like, that was a line in the original. And then when Yuffie joins you, you get that little dialogue sequence that is very reminiscent of the original. I don't know if it was word for word, but it's along the same lines. That stuff's great. I don't know what's going on with Glenn yet.
Yeah, he's here.
There's more we could talk about there, but yeah, clearly Rufus has got some dealings going on.
Oh, I was going to say too, I forgot to mention it in my earlier spiel, but like the way they've done Red 13 is also pretty great. Like, there's like a constant theme of like the townsfolk thinking that he's like a pet or a dog, like, and he does stuff like, dress up as a soldier or like ride a chocobo. Like he does stuff that seems like it would be rather awkward. I'm sure he'll have like his main character arc when you get to Cosmo Canyon, but just the way that he has to operate in the environment, like they just kind of roll with it. Like, and sometimes he acts like a pet, like has to get stuck with that role.
Yeah, I do like Red 13 in this game, and I'm very much looking forward to the Cosmo Canyon arc and how that is going to play out.
I will say I'm getting a little tired of the dog jokes with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if there's nothing else pressing, I think we'll wrap this podcast here. We didn't talk about all the story stuff in chapters 1 through 8, but we'll get to more of that in the next part. We'll definitely talk about Barrett's arc because I do want to give that some space. But yes, we are gonna. This is gonna wrap up our first podcast on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We will have one more podcast whenever we all finish the game, and we'll talk about. That's probably me mostly story stuff. We did a lot of mechanics talk in this one. We're not going to repeat anything we talked about here. We might give some updated final impressions, but it's going to be a whole lot of story stuff. We're going to dig into it, and I'm sure a whole lot of story shenanigans are going to happen in the remaining chapters in the game that we have not seen yet, and we don't know how it goes. But any last thoughts before we bounce out of here? And I'm glad we split this into 2 podcasts because we still have plenty more to talk about, but we will have a chance later.
I mean, how many more mini games do you think we'll need to carve out some time for like the new list of mini games between now and the end of the game?
So if this list I looked at is to be believed, we actually may have seen a good portion of the mini games already. So we might be in luck on there. But as we mentioned earlier, I think there's going to be another round of. My guess would be we'll go back to the Gold Saucer and just have more tiers of the same mini games instead of new mini games. That's my guess, at least. All right. If we don't have anything else, that's gonna wrap up this first podcast on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We'll have another one later. Until then, I have been Flex, joined by Nate, Ryan, and Garrison for this episode of the ATACS podcast. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.